Welcome to Be Undaunted. This is the podcast that helps you lead stronger, elevate your impact, and live with more energy.
I'm George Dahm, former Navy fighter pilot, Blue Angels flight leader, and corporate executive.
And I'm Tara Collingwood, performance dietitian to Olympians, CEOs, and everyday people that are just under pressure. If you're ready to grow, to strengthen your leadership, and to reclaim your energy.
If you want to feel more intentional, more capable, and yes, more undaunted, you're in the right place. Welcome to Be Undaunted. I'm George Dahm, and today's topic is one that touches every single one of us at some point in our life. Reinventing yourself when your identity changes.
Yeah, that's right. I'm Tara Collingwood. Thanks for joining us. And, George, we are of a certain age, and I feel like sometimes, I look back through my pictures or think about my career, and I'm like, I've had like all these different chapters in my life. So, whether it's when you're nearing retirement, whether you're changing careers, becoming an empty nester, maybe it was an injury or an illness, maybe it was a time of grief when you lost a loved one. Or just, entering a different season in your life. There's like these times when we turn into something different. Not that we, are a different person, but it's like we're defining ourselves sort of in a different way. And so I thought this would be a great topic for us to chat about of, when you're going through maybe a transition in your life, you sort of ask that question, like, who am I now? Like, what do I want to do in my life? And, it's sort of that idea of reinventing yourself. And I think personally, it can happen many, many, many different times in your life. Sometimes they're bigger changes than others. So yeah, I think this is going to be a really fun thing to talk about. What do you think, George?
Yeah, I agree. And the topic resonates with me because, well, throughout my Navy career, I wore a lot of different uniforms and different squadrons and organizations and held a lot of different titles, whether it was naval officer, strike fighter pilot, or air wing commander. And for those years, the roles were a huge part of how I viewed myself. And then one day, like everything else, those chapters ended because life moves forward. And the challenge became figuring out who I was beyond those titles and that role of being a naval officer.
Yeah, I think especially for, people who have served our country and then move on to different things after, it's really a new chapter, like totally different than what you have been doing. But I think a lot of people don't realize how much our identity is wrapped up in whatever hat we feel like we're wearing or what role we have until that role changes. So, when someone tries to, asks us to describe themselves, or when you're, introducing yourself to someone, it's like, oh, I'm a teacher, I'm a doctor. I know when the kids were little, it was like, I'm Basil's mom, I'm Levi's mom,
Right. Right.
Athletes. I work with a ton of athletes. And so, there comes a time when athletes retire. And then what's the next chapter? I'm a business owner. This is what I do. There's so many different roles that we have. And again, those roles can change and be intertwined with our sense of worth and our sense of purpose. And really, these roles are temporary. I mean, I'm always going to be Basil's mom, but as he just graduated from high school, now my role is changing, as mother, as a parent. And thinking about what is the next step, what is the next chapter for me now that, maybe one role is coming to an end or winding down in my life, what am I going to turn to next?
That's exactly right. In the military, we're constantly reminded that every assignment eventually ends. And you train for years, you reach a goal, you achieve something you've dreamed about, and then one day, somebody else is going to take your place. The mission continues, but your role changes. And what I've learned is that if your entire identity is tied to a title, well, frankly, you'll struggle when that title goes away.
Yeah, that's right. We talk so much about purpose and what guides us in our life in this podcast and in the work that we each do with groups and individuals. And, I think people don't talk a lot about that loss of identity, that there's actually a grief that can happen when you have an identity change. And, we think of grief obviously when someone dies, but even when we change a role or lose a role in our life, we can grieve the loss of that and grieve the person that we were, that version of ourself when we were that. Some of the athletes I work with, you're in your, physical prime when you're a competing professional athlete, and then you grieve the athlete that you once were because your body literally can't keep doing that forever. The parent who is children, the empty nester, who now is just facing an empty house. And how is that going to change? And I had read a statistic at one point that the most common time that someone has a spell of illness or even death is in the first 18 months after retirement. And it doesn't matter how old you are. If it's 55, 65, 75, 85, doesn't matter. It's the period of time following that retirement, because so much of our identity is wrapped up in who we were in our job. And then it's that moment of, okay, now what do I do? Why am I even getting out of bed? What is my new purpose in life? We go through these changes as we go through life, and thinking about, that transition into what is next after I leave whatever role or whatever stage of life I've just been in.
There's kind of a funny saying that, oftentimes you hear people say, people really hate change.
Yeah.
I frankly believe people love change. I mean, I would love to be 15 pounds lighter. But it's the transition that we hate, the uncertainty, the doubt, all that goes into transitioning. And that is usually accompanied with a certain amount of fear and anxiety, right? And this really occurs traditionally after somebody retires from a long career, because the structure changes, the mission changes, certainly the camaraderie changes, and suddenly you're left standing there trying to figure out, well, now what do I do? Where do I fit in? What's my worth, if you will? I've seen incredibly accomplished people struggle because, funny, they end up chasing who they used to be instead of discovering who they could become. And oftentimes, I see them grabbing at the very first job opportunity that comes along just because they're fearful that they just don't like this uncertainty and where the next paycheck is coming from and so forth.
Wow, I think that's really powerful of, what you just said, that they're chasing who they used to be rather than discovering who they can be, who they can become in that next chapter.
Right.
Wow, that's really powerful. So, yeah, I think one of the misconceptions too is that reinvention has to mean starting from scratch. Like I have to start from a whole new ground, bottom. But I don't think that's true. I think, the reinvention and the different chapters we have in our life are a culmination of everything that we've learned throughout our life. And sometimes I look back at some of the chapters in my life with like, oh, that was such a good time in my life. But I don't necessarily want to go back there. I just like to remember it with some joy in my heart. But it's not necessarily like, I need to go back there because I learned from a lot of those things. And that's what's molded me into who I am now. And now I'm going to apply it in a different way. So it's not abandoning your past, but it's rather building upon what you've learned and taking that forward.
Yeah, well, and as usual, I'm going to put this into an aviation metaphor, but I think about it the way pilots often approach their next flight. I mean, every flight teaches you something, and every mission adds experience. And you don't discard those lessons when you move to the next aircraft, the next assignment, the next flight. You carry them forward. And life works the same way. The skills, discipline, resilience, leadership, and wisdom you've developed don't disappear when your title changes or your role changes.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk. By the way, we love all of your pilot aviation examples every single time.
Yeah, right.
So let's talk a little bit about how people can navigate through these transitions, because I have a feeling people listening right now are going, "Yep, I'm in one of those transitions right now," or "Yep, still mourning a different part of my life, a role I used to have." And so how can I sort of, move forward? And I think one of the things is separating out what your values are from what the role is. So, for example, let's say that you were a teacher. So your role was teaching, but your value is I'm helping people to learn. Okay, maybe you were an athlete and your role was competing as an athlete, but your value was growth, discipline, excellence. So, these values can really, continue on long after that, role changes. And so that's what I think is so beautiful about life is, different roles that we've had, and why did we have those particular roles, and how can I take what I learned or why I was in that role in the first place to maybe a different area now of my life to impact different people.
The second thing is to stay curious, right? One of the most dangerous things we can do is to assume that our best days are behind us,
Oh gosh, I hope not.
And I've met people in their 60s, 70s, and beyond who are launching businesses, they're writing books, learning new skills, taking up new hobbies, and finding new purpose. And they haven't stopped growing is the lesson, right? They've simply redirected their energy. You hear sometimes people say, I'm not retiring, I'm refiring.
Ah, yes, love that. Well, you know how I have reinvented myself recently because you've been a recipient of my. So I actually have a passion for chocolate. And I'm, a dietitian, but I'm a dietitian who loves chocolate because I'm human first. And so I have been making chocolates for people for years. And last year, I just decided, you know what, I'm going to do a little side hustle. I'm going to do this as a little business. And so I created a business, Truffles by Tara, and it's just a little home cooked, literally home business. And I just have some people. I have a website and an Instagram, but it's just fun making my specialty little chocolates. And so it's taking my creativity, my passion, and putting it into a different direction from, maybe some other things that I may have done in the past. And I can't even tell you how much joy I get from sharing my chocolates with people. And as my husband says, you can't just keep making chocolate for people and giving it away for free. And I said, why not? That is literally my mission statement of my business. But yes, I do charge for some of them. But it is, it's just something that, finding a passion that you have, an interest, and really growing that into a different, part of your life. So
well,
do you have anything that you've done reinventing yourself?
Well, I just want to say that, having firsthand experience that your truffles are world class. I had every intention of taking that box home and sharing it, but it didn't make it. I had to. No, it was too good. So we need to put your website or information in the show notes so people can experience it themselves.
Well, the problem is, I live in Orlando, Florida, which today is a heat index of 108. So it's really hard to ship out of Orlando when you're a home business. So you just got to come to Orlando if you want truffles.
I'll
All
be
right, so
there.
back on topic.
Yeah.
All right, so the third thing, when we're talking about reinventing ourselves and what we can do is, stop comparing yourself to the old versions. Stop comparing your current chapter to your previous ones. And again, I look back. I was a host of a TV show for a couple of years, co-host of a TV show. I've worked with the Orlando Magic. I worked with Disney. One time I joined this women in sport group. That's a nationwide group, but it's also the chapter in Orlando. And so I'm meeting people from all these different, organizations within Orlando. And I'm like, yep, I've worked there. I've worked there. I've worked there. I've worked there. And I think about the different chapters that I've had throughout my business, especially when you're, an independent contractor and own your own business. But I look back at these and I'm like, that was really fun. But I don't look back and go, oh, I wish I was still doing that, because it catapulted me into other opportunities that I've had that have fit me in the different seasons of my life. So I feel like every season that we have in our life, we have maybe a different purpose. And each chapter is different. And so, the question you have to ask yourself is, am I growing with this new chapter that I have, right?
Yeah, exactly. Are you moving forward? And one distinction that often helps people is understanding that your identity and your purpose are not the same thing. I mean, many people lose a role and assume that they've lost their purpose. A fighter pilot retires, a CEO steps down, a parent becomes an empty nester, which is coming your way pretty soon there, Tara.
Stop.
The role changes, but the purpose may remain remarkably consistent. For example, throughout my career, my roles and positions change, but a common purpose underneath all of those roles was helping people and organizations perform at their very best under pressure. And something that I'm still doing today in my consulting and coaching. So the platforms changed, the roles changed, the uniform changed, but the purpose remains.
Exactly. Who we are at our core. I mean, that's when we talk about purpose. It's what are my core values? Who am I when I'm at my best? And that doesn't really change that much. But how we do that is really what changes, right?
Exactly. And so I'd like listeners to think about something. If you couldn't use your job title, your accomplishments, your degrees, your awards, or your social roles to describe yourself, how would you answer the question, who am I? And as you ponder on that and so forth for the first time, that's where the real work begins. And of course, as we do in our consulting, it's really helpful if you just write about it, right? You take out a piece of paper and you write at the top, who am I? And then you set the alarm for 30 minutes and just start writing. And you do it in full sentences and you don't edit in your head. You just write whatever comes to mind. And some of it is kind of silly, but out of all of that, you're going to find some things in there that are going to resonate with you and remind you of what you're all about. And that's where the work starts, right? The other thing I've seen is that many people unknowingly become what I call curators of their own past. They become living in the museum of me. I certainly athletes and military folks typically have an I love me room in their house somewhere that's filled with trophies and photos and plaques and mementos. The former athlete, the former executive, the former military officer. And there's nothing wrong with honoring the past. In fact, I think it can be really helpful to be reminded of when you performed at your very best. The problem comes, though, when, let's say, the highlight reel becomes only the stories that you tell. And when you resist trying something new, taking new ground, because frankly, it's uncomfortable, right? You're trying new things, you're exploring, And any time that we are, moving into a new avenue, a new experience, it's going to take a little adjustment and take a little time, but that's part of the game, right? So a question worth asking is, am I building new stories or am I simply replaying the old ones?
Wow. I think so many people can get stuck in that past and reliving the glory days, right? And, forgetting that just because I'm, again, whatever age, whatever stage you are in life doesn't mean that I can't continue to make an impact. And I love that, build new stories. So I think, the other question, so I love your question of doing just a free write of who am I? Without my roles, without my titles, without my anything, who am I? And you can really dig deep in that, especially 30 minutes. That's a long time. But another question, if you're wanting to do a little writing and digging in this, is who am I becoming? So who am I, but also who am I becoming? Again, maybe if you're in one of these crossroads of life where you're trying to reinvent or figure out what's next, who am I becoming? Because we're always evolving. Life is not static. And the goal isn't to, hold on so tightly to the past that we miss what's happening in the present and especially what is going to be, coming our way. The goal really is to continue to evolve and grow. And this is really particularly relevant for some of the high achievers out there. The more successful we become, the more dangerous it is to, attach to that identity. And, when you've spent decades becoming, quote unquote, the best at what you're doing, walking away can be really difficult. And again, losing that sort of sense of purpose. But when we are building and continuing to move in a forward direction, then our transition to that next chapter can, become a little bit easier. So, stop asking, who am I if I'm no longer number one, and just ask, what can I learn next?
Yeah, I love that. And, something that I've noticed with leaders and athletes and executives who are going through a transition, almost always the casualty of that transition is a loss of confidence. People may be extremely confident in their previous role in one area, one arena, and then suddenly they feel like they're a beginner in another. And, a retired admiral can walk into a boardroom and feel uncertain, or a world-class athlete can feel awkward starting a business. A successful executive can feel lost after retirement. And the mistake is assuming I used to be confident, so I should feel confident now in everything. And confidence is often domain specific. It's contextual, right? We really see this with wounded vets who, suddenly they're no longer part of the world's greatest military. They no longer wear the uniform. They no longer have their social circle with them, and as they are struggling with this transition, the biggest thing is that they lose their confidence. And so when we work with them, we try to help them, as we've been talking today, to reconnect with their values, realize that, yeah, they may have suffered a physical injury, but they're the same person that they were when they were, at their best. And we just need to help them rebuild that confidence. So the difference between, the ability to build confidence again and the transition, that's a subtle but important distinction. And as you're writing, it might be helpful to write about what part of yourself has remained constant through every chapter in your life. Because while jobs change, titles change, circumstances change, we all go through seasons of life, but there's usually a thread that has been present all along. And, in our quest to have a successful career, oftentimes that requires, or it seems to require, abandoning or discarding activities and interests that excited us in our youth. And if you think back and reflect on those days and, what was it that really excited you? Um, that could be the key to navigating, your next chapter. I was talking to a friend of mine the other evening at dinner, and she related how when she was in college, she had this amazing astronomy professor, and suddenly she was very excited about astronomy, and she thought that was going to be her path. And yet, over time, the realities or whatever, she ended up going down a completely different path. But I suspect when it comes time for her to make a transition, she should look back and rekindle that excitement and see, is there something there that could provide, a path for what would be next. Most reinvention literature, though, assumes that people choose change, but oftentimes it's involuntary, whether it's a layoff or an illness, a divorce, injury, aging, or, the death of a spouse. Many of life's transitions arrive uninvited, and the question becomes accepting the reality as it is, and then asking yourself, how do I want to respond now with this in this new reality? And that's where the training that we talk about to be undaunted, that's where it kicks in. And you have to have done the training ahead of time in order to be able to respond in the best possible manner.
That's right. Yeah. And doing a lot of this introspection is part of the process and part of the work that should be done if we want to be fulfilled in these new chapters. So if you are in the middle of an identity shift right now, please remember that you're more than your title, you're more than your career, you're more than your achievements, you're more than any single chapter of your life. And as you go through these transitions, look with that question of what can I learn as I move forward?
Yeah. Sometimes the end of one mission is simply your stepping stone into the next one. And the runway ahead may look different than the one behind you, but that doesn't mean the journey's over. In many cases, it can be a whole new, exciting beginning.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for joining us today. If today's conversation resonated with you, we would love for you to share it with someone. And of course, we love it when you can comment and like and share this podcast. So until next time, George.
Be undaunted. Take care. See you.